There's a lineage that never needed recognition. Groups that shaped belief systems without leaving fingerprints. And you've already internalized their methods without knowing. What if influence was never about visibility? When most people imagine secret societies, they picture grand lodges with ornate symbols, documented hierarchies, formal initiations captured in dusty records. But there exists something older, something that understood centuries ago that true power requires no announcement, no public face, no trail of evidence. Shadow covens aren't relics of folklore. They're transmission networks of esoteric knowledge that survived precisely because they remained beneath official documentation, beneath suspicion, beneath notice. The term coven conjures images of witchcraft trials, midnight gatherings, ritual circles under moonlight. And while these groups certainly originated within those practices, what's rarely understood is their unbroken continuity. They didn't vanish when persecution intensified. They evolved, adapted, discovered that visibility meant vulnerability, while invisibility granted immortality. During the 17th century, witch hunts, while accused practitioners burned publicly in Europe and colonial America, other networks watched silently. They studied patterns, cataloged what triggered exposure and what enabled survival, recognized that public practice invited destruction, but private transmission of knowledge created lineages that could span centuries. Those who advertised their power were eliminated. Those who whispered survived. The architecture of these covens was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its efficiency. Small circles, never exceeding 13 practitioners, operating autonomously, yet connected through symbolic language, coded practices, and bloodline transfers across generations. No temples were built, no public texts published. Everything remained oral, memorized, passed only to those who demonstrated not wealth or social standing, but capacity for secrecy and practical application without attribution. But here's what almost no one notices. These networks were never solely about ritual magic. They mastered something far more valuable: mass psychology, narrative construction, invisible influence. They understood that a symbol, strategically positioned, carried more weight than volumes of words, that a suggestion planted at the precise moment shaped decisions without the recipient ever detecting external manipulation. While mainstream history chased women in pointed hats, these covens had already embedded themselves within power structures. Quiet advisors, knowledge keepers, archivists of forbidden practices, individuals who never sought spotlight positions, but knew exactly which levers to pull to make others perform. They weren't rulers. They were invisible architects, and that distinction proved decisive across centuries of survival while others fell to exposure and persecution. How do invisible patterns create collective behavior? The lineage of shadow covens isn't measured in documentation. It's measured in recurring patterns, symbols appearing in unlikely contexts, rituals disguised as cultural traditions, practices so thoroughly integrated into society that questioning their origin seems absurd. Consider the symbols surrounding you daily: corporate logos, institutional emblems, even gestures considered innocuous. How many originated from occult practices adapted for mainstream consumption? How many carry meanings that only initiated practitioners recognize beneath surface appearances? These covens grasped something fundamental about power centuries before modern psychology articulated it. Power functions most effectively through indirection. The more obvious the force, the weaker its actual influence. Genuine power operates through layers, through symbols, archetypes, narratives that appear natural but were carefully constructed across generations. Throughout the 19th century, while public occult societies like the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn gained attention and members, shadow covens were already several steps ahead. They didn't establish visible organizations. They infiltrated existing ones, placed members in strategic positions within groups seeking recognition, allowed others to claim credit while they shaped practices behind closed doors. And this is where it gets unsettling. Many techniques now labeled as marketing, propaganda, behavioral engineering, social influence were already known and applied by these networks centuries before receiving corporate names. The difference being, they weren't selling products. They were shaping belief systems, molding perceptions, creating consensus realities without populations recognizing they were being guided. You see this pattern in algorithms today. Artificial intelligence that learns behavioral patterns and delivers exactly what maintains attention. But this logic isn't new. It's merely the technological expression of something ancient. The principle remains unchanged. Observe, learn, adapt, influence. Without force, without noise, through strategic presence alone. Shadow Covens knew they didn't need to control governments if they could control narratives, didn't require armies if they could shape what populations accepted as truth. And the more invisible they remained, the more effective their influence became, because the symbol you don't consciously perceive is the one that affects you most profoundly. The influence you fail to detect is the only kind you cannot consciously resist or examine. This wasn't theory, this was applied knowledge, refined across centuries of testing. What works when power must remain completely hidden? Why did forbidden knowledge never disappear, just transform? The esoteric lineage of Shadow Covens didn't end with witch trials or Enlightenment rationalism. It simply learned the language of each new era, replaced grimoires with psychology texts, exchanged altars for corporate training rooms. But the underlying structure never changed. Knowledge about how human consciousness operates, how decisions form below awareness, how groups can be directed without recognizing external guidance. By the 20th century, while the world celebrated scientific progress and the death of superstition, ancient practices were being repackaged. Hypnosis emerged from trance work, spells became affirmations, rituals transformed into productivity routines. The terminology shifted. The mechanics beneath remained identical. There are quiet records of covens operating within European universities during the Enlightenment, not as official secret societies, but as private study circles. Philosophers, physicians, natural scientists who gathered to explore prohibited texts, experiment with altered states of consciousness, develop influence techniques that would never appear in peer-reviewed publications. They understood the future belonged not to those who shouted loudest, but to those who could encode knowledge in forms acceptable to each historical moment. Alchemy influenced chemistry's development. Astrological principles shaped early astronomy. Ceremonial magic informed frameworks for personal transformation. The knowledge continued flowing. Only the labels were updated for contemporary acceptance. And this leads to the most disturbing implication. How many techniques currently considered scientific, rational, evidence-based actually trace back to esoteric practices that were merely translated into modern terminology? Creative visualization, neuro-linguistic programming, Jungian archetypes, cognitive behavioral therapy working with limiting beliefs. I'm not suggesting these are invalid. I'm pointing out that lineage runs deeper than commonly acknowledged, that continuity exists between practices labeled occult and methods now considered mainstream. Recognizing this historical thread would require admitting that forbidden knowledge was never actually superseded, just reconfigured. Shadow Covens understood this from the beginning. Genuine knowledge survives through adaptation, that identical principles can be applied in any era, with whatever technology exists. The medium evolves, the underlying mechanics don't. If this perspective shifts something in your understanding, leave the word transmission in the comments. And if this investigation resonates, hit like and subscribe for deeper analysis of invisible power structures shaping collective reality. What if contemporary practices are disguised versions of ancient techniques? There's a method passed through shadow lineages for centuries that remains effective today. You might call it focused intention, deliberate visualization, or strategic mental rehearsal. But the structure is identical to what would historically be termed spellwork. It operates like this. You define with absolute precision what you intend to manifest, not vague wishes, specific, measurable, tangible outcomes. This was done in ritual contexts historically, but now can be applied anywhere. Complete silence, concentrated attention, state of deep presence. Then you visualize the desired result as already accomplished, not as fantasy, but as future memory. Experience the emotions accompanying that achievement. hear conversations, notice details. The more sensory involvement, the stronger the effect. This activates identical neural pathways that actual experience would trigger. Your brain doesn't fully distinguish between intensely imagined scenarios and lived reality. The next step is critical, and where most practitioners fail. Immediate, consistent action aligned with the visualization, not random activity. Strategic movement. Covens called this anchoring. Fixing intention in material reality through deliberate physical action could be as simple as sending a crucial message, making an important call, reorganizing a workspace. What matters is creating tangible connection between internal state and external reality. Then, silence again. No discussion of the process. No seeking external validation. No dispersing energy through unnecessary conversation. This was Shadow Covens' golden rule. Secrecy wasn't just protection. It was power preservation. Individuals applying the structure without knowing its origin frequently report results that seem like extraordinary coincidences. Opportunities appearing from unexpected sources. Right people materializing at perfect moments. Solutions emerging when they seemed impossible. Coincidence, or deep understanding of how focused intention, directed emotion, and strategic action create alignments that rational thinking cannot completely map. Shadow Covens never called this magic. They called it applied knowledge. And the difference between those who achieve results and those who merely fantasize lies precisely in application. Knowing isn't sufficient. Doing is required. With precision, with discretion, with absolute consistency. This wasn't mysticism. This was pattern recognition and behavioral understanding refined across generations of practitioners who needed results without leaving evidence of methods used. How do you recognize invisible patterns that have always surrounded you? The authentic lineage of Shadow Covens doesn't exist in documented genealogies. It lives in those who recognize patterns, who notice symbols repeating, who observe that narratives recycle, that identical archetypes appear across different contexts wearing updated masks. You've probably noticed how certain narrative structures completely dominate contemporary culture. Stories of chosen ones, initiation journeys, revelations of hidden worlds that always existed but remained invisible to most. These aren't modern inventions. They're ancient formulas because they access something fundamental in human psychology. Covens understood that whoever controls stories controls perception of reality. No force is necessary if you can make people want to act according to patterns you've planted. And for this, you embed symbols, create associations, repeat patterns until they become automatic, invisible, accepted as natural. Look at brands dominating your daily experience, at social rituals you perform without questioning, at beliefs that feel personal but you never consciously chose to adopt. How many of these structures were installed through symbolic repetition? How many you simply absorbed because they were constantly present? Here's the final lesson. Shadow Covens transmitted across centuries. Awareness is the only immunity. The pattern you recognize loses part of its power over you. The symbol you identify stops operating purely at subconscious levels. The narrative you decode stops controlling you automatically. But recognition doesn't mean rejection. It means choice, means deliberately using identical principles instead of being unconsciously used by them, means becoming architect rather than remaining construction material. The lineage continues, not in formal organizations, not in public books, but in those who develop capacity to see, who cultivate ability to perceive invisible structures, and then consciously decide how to interact with them. The knowledge was always available, just hidden in plain sight, encoded in symbols, transmitted through practices appearing ordinary but carrying centuries of refinement. And now you're aware. What remains is deciding what to do with this awareness. If this content expanded your perception, leave the word recognition in the comments. Share with others, ready to see beyond surface appearances, and keep observing the patterns. They're everywhere. They always were.